Blood stained the cobblestones of Whitechapel long before the infamous Autumn of Terror, but the man bleeding out in the alleyway was no ordinary victim. He was a duke stripped of his mind, and the impoverished seamstress who dragged his broken body from the gutter already knew his deepest, darkest secret. Rain lashed against the soot-stained bricks of Fournier Street, turning the London gutters into rushing rivers of filth. Beatrice Croft, her fingers raw and pricked from 14 continuous hours of stitching heavy morning crepe, hurried through the downpour. She had just delivered a hastily altered gown to the household of Lady Gwendolen Bertie, and the meagre shillings in her pocket were the only barrier between her and starvation. She almost tripped over him. He was a crumpled mass of dark wool and mud, wedged between a rusted iron lamp-post and a brick wall. Most of the East End locals would have walked past, assuming the man was simply another victim of the local gin palaces. But Beatrice saw the glint of a pocket watch chain, not brass but solid gold, half torn from a waistcoat made of a silk jacquard so fine it could only have been woven in the private mills of Lyon. Kneeling in the freezing muck, Beatrice rolled the man onto his back. A deep, jagged wound marred the side of his skull, the blood matting his thick, dark hair. His face was beaten, swollen, and bruised, yet underneath the violence lay the unmistakable bone structure of the aristocracy. He was breathing, though barely. She should have left him. She should have run to the nearest constable under Sir Robert Peel's newly formed Metropolitan Force. But then her eyes fell upon his right hand, hanging limply against the wet stone. On his little finger rested a heavy gold signet ring. Beatrice's breath hitched, the freezing rain suddenly forgotten. The crest was deeply engraved, a roaring lion clutching a rose, flanked by 2 crossed swords. It was the seal of the Duke of Ashbourne. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She knew this man. She knew the face beneath the blood, though she had only seen it from afar, hidden behind the velvet curtains of the Ashbourne Manor Library 5 years ago. This was Leopold Harrington. Leopold Harrington was the man whose powerful estate had falsely accused Beatrice's father, the manor's dedicated archivist, of embezzlement. Her father had discovered a discrepancy in the estate's ledgers, massive fraud orchestrated by Leopold's ruthless cousin, Reginald. Before her father could bring the evidence to the young duke, Reginald had framed him. Arthur Croft died in a damp cell in Newgate Prison, waiting for a trial that never came, leaving his daughter to flee into the anonymity of London's poorest slums. Beatrice stared at the dying duke. Vengeance whispered in her ear, urging her to walk away and let the Harrington line end in the gutter. But her father had been a man of honor, and she could not let a man bleed to death, not even a Harrington. With agonizing effort, Beatrice hauled his limp arm over her shoulder. She was small, but years of hauling heavy bolts of velvet and brocade up narrow tenement stairs had made her strong. Step by agonizing step, she dragged the Duke of Ashbourne through the labyrinth of the East End, slipping through shadows until they reached her cramped, freezing attic room. For 3 days and 3 nights the fever ravaged him. Beatrice spent the last of her Bertie shillings on clean bandages, carbolic soap, and a meagre measure of coal. She cleaned the vicious wound on his head, a clear sign of a blunt force attack meant to kill. Someone had tried to assassinate the Duke. On the morning of the 4th day, the rain finally broke, letting a sliver of weak autumn sunlight pierce the grimy window pane. A groan broke the silence. Beatrice dropped her sewing shears and rushed to the cot. Leopold's eyes fluttered open. They were a piercing, storm-glass grey, but the arrogance she expected to find in them was completely absent. Instead, there was only a vast, terrifying emptiness. "Don't move," Beatrice commanded softly, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You took a terrible blow to the skull." He blinked, his gaze darting around the peeling wallpaper, the dressmaker's dummy, and finally settling on her face. "Where am I?" His voice was a raspy baritone, scraped raw from disuse. "You are safe. In Spitalfields," she answered cautiously. "I found you in an alley. Do you know your name?" Leopold stared at her, then looked at his own hands. He frowned, a flicker of panic rising in his chest. He closed his eyes tightly, searching the dark corridors of his mind, but found only locked doors. He swallowed hard. "I don't know. I have no idea who I am." Beatrice froze. The physician she couldn't afford to call would have warned her of this. Amnesia, the trauma to his head, had wiped the slate of the Duke of Ashbourne completely clean. "What do I call you?" he asked, looking at her with a vulnerability that completely unsettled her. She looked down at the signet ring she had removed from his finger and hidden in her sewing box alongside her father's cleared ledgers. She could tell him the truth. She could send him back to Mayfair. But if the man who tried to kill him, undoubtedly Reginald, found out he was alive, Leopold would be dead before the week was out, and Beatrice would lose her only chance to use the Duke to clear her father's name. "Your name," Beatrice lied smoothly, her heart hammering against her ribs, "is John. You are a merchant's clerk, and you were mugged on your way home." Weeks bled into a bitter London winter. The man who now believed himself to be John healed with the robust vitality of a man accustomed to an excellent diet and a lifetime of horseback riding, not the weak constitution of an East End clerk. As his strength returned, so did a frustratingly charming personality that Beatrice had entirely not anticipated. Stripped of the suffocating expectations of the peerage and the sycophants of high society, Leopold Harrington was, to Beatrice's deep dismay, witty, observant, and fiercely protective of her. He began assisting her in her trade. Though his hands were scarred from the attack, his fingers were long and elegant, possessing an instinctual grace. When Beatrice struggled to drape a complicated bustle for a demanding client, it was Leopold who casually adjusted the silk taffeta, his eye for symmetry and high-class fashion completely instinctual. "Like this, Bea," he murmured one evening, standing close behind her, his hands guiding hers over the dressmaker's dummy. The warmth of his chest pressed lightly against her back. "The fabric wants to fall this way. It requires a softer touch." Ah! Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She could smell the cheap lye soap he had washed with, mingled with the uniquely crisp, masculine scent that was entirely his own. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Leopold stepped back, looking at his own hands with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. "I don't know. It just feels right, like a ghost of a memory." The lie she had constructed was becoming a prison for them both. Every day the bond between the humble seamstress and the broken Duke deepened into something profound and undeniable. They shared meager meals of bread and thin stew by the fire, laughing over the absurd demands of her wealthy clients. In the quiet darkness of the attic, when the city outside descended into a hush, they shared whispered fears and dreams. He looked at her not as a servant, not as a lower-class laborer, but as the woman who had saved him, his anchor in a world of fog. And Beatrice was falling desperately in love with the very man she had sworn to use. But reality was violently knocking at their door. During her trips to the markets, Beatrice scavenged discarded copies of the Times and the Morning Post. The headlines screamed of tragedy in Mayfair. The Duke of Ashbourne presumed dead. Body lost to the Fanes. Cosen Lord Reginald to inheritates. Reginald had moved swiftly. Just as Lord Salisbury addressed Parliament on the economic crisis, Reginald was securing his grip on the Harrington fortune, liquidating assets and tearing through the manor's staff. Beatrice knew that once Reginald was officially crowned the new Duke, any evidence of his past embezzlements and her father's innocence would be destroyed forever. The pressure was mounting. Leopold was beginning to experience blinding headaches, flashes of memory that left him gasping for air. A carriage with a crest, a grand staircase, the smell of expensive cigars, and a man pushing him into the dark. "Bay," he whispered one night, clutching his head as the fire died down to embers. "Someone wanted me dead. I knew it. I can feel the malice of it." "You were mugged, John," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. She reached out, stroking his dark hair to soothe him. He caught her hand, pressing her palm to his lips in a gesture so intimate it made her heart ache. "No," he said fiercely, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers. "It was personal, and I am terrified that whoever it was will find me and hurt you." The twisting knot of guilt in Beatrice's stomach tightened. She had to take him back. She had to show him the ring, reveal his identity, and help him reclaim his throne before Reginald finalized the theft of the dukedom. But she was terrified that the moment he remembered he was the Duke of Ashbourne, He would realize she had lied to him for months. He would return to his palaces, his high society, and she would simply be the dust beneath his polished boots once more. The decision, however, was violently ripped from her hands the very next afternoon. Beatrice was in the front room of the small shop she rented below her attic, measuring a length of black velvet when the silver bell above the door chimed. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Standing in the doorway was a man wrapped in an opulent fur-lined greatcoat, his silver-tipped cane resting against the floorboards. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and cruel. Accompanying him was a striking woman draped in the latest Parisian couture, her face hidden behind a delicate mourning veil. Beatrice's blood ran cold, her hands freezing on the velvet. It was Lord Reginald Harrington. And beside him was Lady Arabella, the daughter of the Earl of Cadogan, the woman who had been Leopold's fiancée, now resting her gloved hand intimately on the arm of his attempted murderer. "I was told," Reginald drawled, his eyes sweeping over the humble shop with undisguised disgust, "that you are the only seamstress in the East End capable of altering French silk without butchering it. My fiancé requires a gown refitted for our upcoming wedding." Beatrice couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. If Reginald looked past her, if he saw the curtain to the back room part. And then the curtain rustled. Heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. "Bea, I finished the hem on the—" Leopold stepped out from the back room, a spool of thread in one hand, freezing mid-sentence as his eyes met the gaze of the man who had tried to kill him. Silence descended upon the cramped shop, thick and suffocating as the London fog pressing against the window panes. Lord Reginald's cruel gaze snapped toward the back room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the towering silhouette of the man standing in the doorway. Leopold froze, his fingers gripping the wooden spool of thread so tightly his knuckles turned white. His storm-gray eyes locked with Reginald's. A violent shudder ripped through Leopold's frame. He didn't know this man in the opulent fur coat, yet his pulse roared in his ears like a terrifying warning, and a phantom pain exploded at the base of his skull. Reginald tilted his head, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his aristocratic features. The man before him was gaunt, his face obscured by a thick, untamed beard and a brutal, jagged scar that slashed through his hairline. He wore the rough, coarse wool of an East End labourer, smelling of lye and cheap coal. He looked nothing like the immaculately groomed Duke of Ashbourne who had supposedly drowned in the Thames. Yet Reginald took a half-step forward, his silver-tipped cane hovering above the floorboards. "Do I know you, fellow?" he demanded, his voice lacing with sudden, sharp suspicion. Beatrice moved on pure, desperate instinct. She violently knocked over a heavy brass mannequin stand. It crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter, shattering the tension and causing Lady Arabella to shriek and clutch her velvet skirts. "Forgive him, my lord," Beatrice cried out, throwing herself between Leopold and the aristocrats, her head bowed in aggressive subservience. "He is my brother, Arthur. He returned from the Zulu War at Rorke's Drift with a fractured skull. He is entirely mute, deaf in one ear, and his mind is half gone, sir." The sudden noise startled him. Reginald stared at Beatrice, his lip curling in profound distaste. He looked back at Leopold, whose face was now completely drained of color, his eyes glassy with an agonizing internal battle, as fragmented memories battered his consciousness. The mute brother act was convincing only because Leopold genuinely looked as though he were losing his mind. "Keep your half-witted relatives out of sight when attending to your betters," Reginald sneered, snapping his gaze away. He tossed a heavy silk gown onto Beatrice's cutting table. "The waist must be taken in 2 inches. Have it delivered to the Ashbourne estate by Friday, or you shall not see a single shilling from Coots & Co. Come, Arabella. The stench of this place is giving me a migraine." The silver bell chimed as the door slammed shut. For 10 agonizing seconds, neither Beatrice nor Leopold moved. Then Leopold collapsed. He hit the floorboards with a heavy thud, his hands flying to his head as he let out a guttural scream of agony. Beatrice rushed to his side, sliding her arms around his broad shoulders, trying to anchor him as he thrashed. John, look at me," she pleaded, tears cutting through the dust on her cheek. "My name is not John," he roared, his voice tearing through the small shop. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face as the dam in his mind finally, violently broke. The docks. It was the docks by Wapping. I was inspecting the cargo manifests for the East India Company. He grabbed Beatrice's arms, his grit bruising, his eyes wild with terror and rage. He paid them, the men in the alley. I saw him hand them the silver. He stood there and watched as they brought the lead pipe down on my skull. Beatrice's breath hitched. Who? Reginald, Leopold gasped, the revelation hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He is my cousin, and I am. He looked around the poverty-stricken shop, the illusion of his simple life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Good God, I am Leopold Harrington. I am the Duke of Ashbourne. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with the weight of absolute truth. Leopold looked at Beatrice, expecting her to gasp, to fall to her knees, to apologize for treating a peer of the realm like a common errand boy. Instead, Beatrice simply closed her eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. She stood up, walked over to her sewing box, and retrieved the heavy gold signet ring. She walked back and held it out to him on her open palm. Leopold stared at the roaring lion crest. He looked from the ring to her face. Recognition, sharp and devastating, dawned in his eyes. You knew. I knew, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Since when? Since the night I pulled you from the mud. Betrayal, hot and southern, flared in his chest. He snatched the ring from her hand, staggering to his feet. You lied to me, he snarled, the aristocratic authority suddenly returning to his posture, making him seem 10 feet tall. For months you let me believe I was a nobody. You watched me struggle. You let me mend your dresses and sweep your floors, knowing I had an estate, a title, a life that was stolen from you. Beatrice fired back, refusing to cower. The meek seamstress vanished, replaced by the furious, grieving daughter. If I had taken you to the authorities, Reginald would have found you in a hospital ward and finished the job. You were broken, bleeding, and defenseless. And what of you? He demanded, stepping closer. Why risk the wrath of the gallows to harbor a dead duke? What is your game, Beatrice? She marched to the loose floorboard under her cutting table, pried it up, and pulled out a stack of leather-bound ledgers. She threw them onto the table. My game, your grace, is justice. Leopold frowned, looking at the faded gold lettering on the spine. They were the private accounts of the Ashbourne estate. My father was Arthur Croft, Beatrice said, her voice shaking with unshed tears. Your head archivist. 5 years ago, he discovered that Reginald had been siphoning tens of thousands of pounds from your estate into foreign holdings at the Rothschild Bank. Before my father could bring you the evidence, Reginald framed him for the theft. My father died in Newgate Prison, and you signed the warrant that put him there. Leopold went completely still. He looked down at the ledgers. He remembered Arthur Croft, a quiet, diligent man. He remembered Reginald bringing him the doctored books, feigning outrage. He remembered signing the document with this very signet ring, carelessly trusting his own blood over a servant. The weight of his own arrogance crushed him. He looked at Beatrice, the rough hands, the threadbare clothes, the dark circles under her eyes. This was the life his negligence had condemned her to. Yet she had still dragged him from the gutter. She had spent her last pennies to keep him alive. Leopold slowly reached out and picked up the ledgers. He opened them, his eyes scanning the columns. The fraud was so blatantly obvious, so arrogantly executed, that he felt sick to his stomach. He is moving the last of my liquid assets tomorrow, Leopold murmured, his voice deadly quiet. I read it in the Morning Post. He is finalizing the inheritance at the charity gala at the Savoy Hotel. Once the documents are signed with the bank magistrates, the money will be untouchable in Switzerland, and my title will officially be his. Beatrice looked at him. Then we take these ledgers to Scotland Yard. No, Leopold said, his eyes darkening with a dangerous, vengeful fire. Reginald owns half the magistrates in London. If we hand this to the police, it will disappear, and we will be found floating in the Thames. He looked at the French silk gown Reginald had tossed onto the table. If we are to destroy a duke, Beatrice, we must do it in the light, in front of the entirety of London's high society, where his money cannot buy silence. The newly opened Savoy Hotel was a marvel of the modern age, entirely illuminated by electric light. It blazed like a diamond on the Strand, a beacon of obscene wealth and power. Inside the Lancaster ballroom, the elite of British society clinked crystal glasses filled with imported champagne. Prime Minister William Gladstone was rumoured to be in attendance alongside Lord Chief Justice Coleridge. It was the perfect stage for Reginald Harrington to solidify his triumph. A carriage pulled up to the grand entrance. The footman opened the door, and the crowd of onlookers gasped. Stepping out was a woman of devastating elegance. She wore a gown of midnight blue French silk, perfectly tailored to her figure, the bustle cascading behind her like a waterfall of shadows. A black lace veil obscured her eyes, but her posture commanded absolute authority. Beside her, offering his arm, was her escort. He wore a sharply tailored evening tailcoat, his dark hair slicked back, his beard trimmed to a distinguished aristocratic point. The scar on his forehead was barely visible beneath a dusting of theatrical powder. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she took Leopold's arm. "Are you certain about this?" she whispered under her breath as they ascended the marble steps. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Leopold replied, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. They bypassed the guest list with a forged invitation, courtesy of Beatrice's underworld connections in Spitalfields. As they entered the ballroom, the sheer scale of the opulence threatened to suffocate Beatrice. But Leopold moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a man returning to his own territory. He guided her through the sea of silk and diamonds, his eyes locked on the elevated dais at the far end of the room. There stood Lord Reginald, holding a glass of champagne, flanked by Lady Arabella and a stout man in severe legal robes, the chief magistrate of Coutts & Co. On a velvet-draped table lay a stack of thick vellum documents, the transfer of the Ashbourne dukedom and its vast fortunes. Reginald tapped his spoon against his glass. The ballroom fell silent. "Lords, ladies, and distinguished guests," Reginald projected, his voice oozing with practiced sorrow. "We are gathered tonight in the name of charity, but also in the shadow of great personal tragedy. My dear cousin, Leopold, Duke of Ashbourne, was taken from us too soon by the treacherous waters of the Thames. Tonight, as I reluctantly take up the heavy mantle of his legacy, I vow to lead the Harrington family into a new era." Reginald turned to the table, picking up a gold fountain pen. He hovered the nib over the dotted line of the primary deed. "I object." The words rang out across the silent ballroom, sharp as a rifle crack. Reginald froze. The pen hovered in the air. He turned slowly, searching the crowd. The sea of aristocrats parted like the Red Sea. Leopold Harrington stepped out of the crowd, the electric lights catching the hard, unforgiving angles of his face. Beatrice stood firmly at his side, her chin held high. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Several women fainted. Lady Arabella dropped her champagne glass, the crystal shattering on the marble floor. Reginald's face drained of all color, taking on the waxy pallor of a corpse. It cannot be," he stammered, stepping back so fast he knocked over a chair. "Guards, arrest this man. He is an impostor, a madman from the slums." "Am I Reginald?" Leopold asked, his voice echoing with terrible, righteous fury. He raised his right hand, the heavy gold signet ring glinting under the chandeliers. "Or did you simply fail to strike hard enough in that alleyway in Wapping?" Murmurs of shock and horror erupted through the crowd. Lord Chief Justice Coleridge, standing near the front, stepped forward, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in deep consternation. "Your Grace?" he asked tentatively. "Is it truly you?" "It is, Lord Coleridge," Leopold stated, holding his ground as two of Reginald's hired thugs moved toward him. Leopold didn't even flinch. He simply snapped his fingers. Beatrice stepped forward, pulling the heavy leather-bound ledgers from beneath her silk shawl. She walked directly to the Lord Chief Justice and placed them in his hands. "What is this?" Coleridge demanded. "Proof, my lord," Beatrice said, her voice clear and ringing. "Proof that Lord Reginald has embezzled over £200,000 from the Ashbourne estate over the last 7 years. Proof that he framed my father Arthur Croft to cover his crimes. And proof of his motive to assassinate the Duke." "Lies!" Reginald shrieked, entirely losing his aristocratic composure. He lunged toward the table, reaching inside his tailcoat. The glint of a silver Derringer pistol flashed in the light. Screams erupted, but Leopold was faster. The months of grueling manual labor in Spitalfields had hardened him, stripping away the soft padding of nobility. He vaulted over the magistrate's table, grabbing Reginald's wrist and twisting it violently upward. The gun fired into the vaulted ceiling, raining plaster down on the panicked guests. With a brutal strike to the knee, Leopold sent his treacherous cousin crashing to the floor. Leopold placed a heavy boot squarely on Reginald's chest, pinning him down as officers of the Metropolitan Police who had been stationed outside for the Prime Minister's protection swarmed into the room. "Take this filth out of my sight," Leopold commanded, his chest heaving as the police dragged a screaming, sobbing Reginald away. The ballroom was in absolute chaos, but Leopold ignored it all. He turned his back on the magistrates, the Prime Minister, and the gaping aristocracy. He walked straight to Beatrice, who stood shaking by the overturned table. Without a word, the Duke of Ashbourne sank to one knee before the humble East End seamstress, right in the center of the Lancaster ballroom. "I was a man without a name, without a past, and without a soul," Leopold said, his voice carrying clearly over the whispers of the crowd. He took her raw, needle-pricked hands in his. "You gave me life, Beatrice Croft. You gave me truth, and if you will have me, I would spend the rest of my days ensuring you never have to mend another broken thing as long as you live." Beatrice looked down at the man who had been her greatest enemy, her closest companion, and finally her salvation. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pulled him up by his lapels. "Only if you promise," she whispered, a watery smile breaking across her face, "never to lose your mind again." Leopold pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply as the flashbulbs of the press cameras ignited around them, forever capturing the moment the Duke chose the seamstress over his crown. Did Beatrice and Leopold's fight against the corrupt aristocracy leave you breathless? If you love this tale of a fallen duke and a brave seamstress, hit that like button and share it with your fellow history and romance lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life historical dramas delivered straight to your feed. What should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments below.